The winter air in Chicago had always been honest. It didn't pretend to be gentle, and it didn't ask for permission before it cut through you. On this particular February evening, that honesty felt like a welcome companion to the man standing in the vast, unfinished space that would one day be his presidential library. The Obama Presidential Center was rising from the ground in Jackson Park, a promise of legacy carved in steel and stone. But tonight, it was just a shell against the wind whipping off Lake Michigan. Barack Obama stood by a floor-to-ceiling window on the upper level, his hands in the pockets of a well-worn cardigan. Below him, the city sprawled out in a grid of light, a Chibon of human endeavor he had once helped to oversee on a much larger scale. Behind him, in the makeshift green room that smelled of fresh paint and sawdust, his team was waiting. They had an interview to do in a few minutes with a young podcaster, Brian Tyler Cohen. It was supposed to be a conversation about the library, about community organizing, about the mechanics of hope in a fractured digital age. But the news alerts buzzing on everyone's phones had shifted the gravity of the room. A few miles away and a universe apart in the halls of power, a video had been posted to the Truth Social account of the President of the United States. It was a crudely made piece of content, a conspiracy-laden screed about the 2020 election. At the very end, for a fleeting second, the faces of Barack and Michelle Obama were superimposed onto the bodies of apes. The song "The Lion Sleeps Tonight" played in the background. By the time the sun had risen over the East Coast, the post had been seen by millions. It had been liked, shared, and defended by the White House press secretary as an innocent internet meme, a Lion King reference. It had been seen by millions, and it had been quietly deleted nearly 12 hours later, with the administration blaming an errant staffer. In the green room, Obama's longtime advisor, a sturdy woman named Valerie, who had been with him since the days of state Senate campaigns, handed him a tablet. He scrolled through the feed silently. He saw the video stills, the headline from the Indian Express that would later call his response a powerful defense of public decency. He saw the comments from the CNN anchors calling it vile and racist. He saw the statement from the NAACP president in Kentucky, who said it was an act of dehumanization rooted in America's darkest chapters. He did not see an apology from the man in the Oval Office. Barack Obama let out a long, slow breath. It wasn't a sigh of sadness, but of recognition. He handed the tablet back. "You know," he said, his voice quiet, barely above a whisper, "I used to think that the office itself commanded a certain level of respect, that the sheer weight of it, the history of it, would humble anyone who sat in that chair." He turned away from the window and faced Valerie. "I was wrong. The office doesn't command respect. The person in it does." The interview was about to begin. The podcaster, a thoughtful young man with a gentle demeanor, was set up in the corner. The cameras rolled. For 47 minutes they talked about the library, about immigration protests, about electoral boundaries. But then the conversation turned. It had to. The video was the elephant in the room, or rather the ugly, undeniable truth that hung in the air between them. Brian leaned forward. "Mr. President, I have to ask you about something that's been dominating the news cycle. There was a video posted from the president's account. It depicted you and the former First Lady in a way that many are calling racist. The White House called it a meme. I'm wondering what your reaction is." Obama paused. He didn't look away. He didn't deflect with a joke, though the audience knew he could. He had spent 8 years deflecting with humor, with grace, with a coolness that had driven his successor to distraction. But this moment felt different. It felt like a line had been crossed so many times that the line itself had been erased, and someone needed to redraw it, if only with words. He began to speak slowly, deliberately.
It's important to recognize that the majority of the American people find this behavior deeply troubling, he said. He wasn't just talking about the video. He was talking about the ecosystem that produced it. He was talking about the normalization of cruelty. He talked about public discussion in the United States, how it had devolved to a level of cruelty that we haven't seen before. He referenced the clown show that was happening on social media and on television, the constant churn of outrage that kept people distracted from the real issues that affected their lives, healthcare, wages, the air they breathe. But it was the next part that landed with the force of a physical blow. It was the part that would be clipped, replayed, and analyzed for days to come. He leaned forward, his eyes holding a seriousness that silenced the room. What is true is that there doesn't seem to be any shame about this among people who used to feel like you had to have some sort of decorum and a sense of propriety and respect for the office. That's been lost. Shame. He used the word shame. It was an old-fashioned concept, a dusty relic from a time when public figures understood that their behavior reflected on the nation itself. He was pointing out that the guardrails were gone, that the thing that stops a person from saying the cruelest thing, from doing the most degrading act, had atrophied. It wasn't just about a racist video. It was about the absence of a conscience in the public square. The room was silent. The camera crew, the aides, the podcaster, everyone was still. It was the silence of recognition. It was the silence that falls when someone speaks a truth that everyone has been feeling, but no one has been able to articulate. The brutal truth wasn't delivered with a shout or a fist pound. It was delivered with the quiet disappointment of a man who had once believed in the goodness of the system, looking at the wreckage of that belief. When the interview ended and the lights clicked off, Obama stood up and shook Brian's hand. He walked back to the window. The city lights still twinkled below, indifferent to the political storms raging in the Capitol. He thought about the long arc of the moral universe. He still believed it bent toward justice, but he also knew it didn't bend on its own. It required people to pull it, and it required a certain kind of courage. Not the courage to fight, but the courage to feel ashamed when you were wrong. The story didn't end in Chicago. It ricocheted across the country, landing in living rooms and barber shops and office break rooms. In Frankfort, Kentucky, Christy Powell, the president of a race relations organization, watched the clip of Obama's response and felt a wave of validation. Her phone had been flooded with screenshots of that video when it first dropped. She had sat in her office looking at the image of a former president and first lady depicted as apes and felt the sting of 100 years of history. It's a reminder of where we fought so hard to come from and how much people are trying to keep us right there in that same place, she had told a local reporter. Hearing Obama speak about shame felt like someone had finally named the ghost in the room. It wasn't just politics, it was dignity. It was the fundamental acknowledgement that some things are beneath us. In Lexington, Whit Whitaker, the head of the local NAACP chapter, had been blunt in his assessment of the original post. He called it an act of dehumanization rooted in America's darkest chapters. When he saw Obama's response, he nodded slowly. The former president hadn't taken the bait of a direct political brawl. He had elevated the conversation to a moral plane. He was talking about the soul of the country, not just the tactics of the moment.
Meanwhile, in Washington, the defenses were up. The White House press secretary, Carolyn Leavitt, had stuck to the script. This is from an internet meme video depicting President Trump as the king of the jungle and Democrats as characters from The Lion King, she had told reporters, waving off the controversy with a flick of her wrist. She called for an end to the fake outrage, demanding that the press focus on things that actually matter. The dismissal was as predictable as it was revealing. To them, the degradation of the first black president was merely a meme.
It was content. It was a way to own the libs and fire up the base. But the defenses had cracks. Not everyone in the Republican Party was willing to go along. In the Senate, Tim Scott, the only black Republican, was visibly shaken when asked about it. He called it the most racist thing I've seen out of this White House and said he was praying it was fake. He urged the president to take it down. The fact that he had to pray it was fake was a statement in itself. The fact that a sitting senator had to ask the president to delete a racist post about his predecessor spoke to the bizarre new normal. The top Democrat in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, who had himself been the target of a racist AI image from Trump showing him in a sombrero, was far less measured. He called Trump vile, unhinged, and malignant, and a sick individual. He demanded that every single Republican denounce the disgusting bigotry. It was the language of outrage, the language of the fight. But Obama had chosen a different language. He had chosen the language of disappointment, and somehow, in the silence that followed his words, disappointment felt more powerful than rage. The contrast between the two presidents became the story itself. Just weeks earlier, in the heat of a different controversy, Trump had been asked about Obama. During a rally in Kentucky, standing on a stage with the boxer Jake Paul, Trump had veered off into a strange tangent about his predecessor. The only thing I admired about Barack Hussein Obama, which was nothing actually, he had said, drawing laughs from the crowd, but the only thing is the way he was bopping down the stairs. You talk about unpresidential. He's bop, and I couldn't believe that he made it without at least a noticeable major fall. The obsession was palpable. It was in the way he refused to say his name without the middle one, a dog whistle to the birther conspiracy that had launched his political career. It was in the way he fixated on Obama's physicality, his coolness, his ease. He had spent years trying to recreate the iconic image of Obama in the Situation Room during the bin Laden raid, the famous photo of the president leaning forward in a cramped room, watching the mission unfold. In early March, as Trump launched military strikes on Iran, his team released a photo of him in a makeshift Situation Room at his Mar-a-Lago estate. He wore a white USA cap and sat surrounded by aides. The internet immediately compared it to the 2011 photo of Obama. The verdict was swift and brutal. A viral post from a young Democrat named Isaiah Martin juxtaposed the two images with the caption, "This dude has been trying to recreate that Obama photo for a decade now and has failed every time." The post garnered millions of views. The comments were a mix of mockery and political analysis. Some pointed out that Obama's photo was candid, tense, real, a moment of history captured by an official photographer. Trump's looked staged, an attempt to manufacture gravitas. One user wrote, "He nailed douchebags in a room perfectly, though." Another noted, "Maybe because Obama is not the center of the situation, nor the pick." The comparison highlighted something deeper than aesthetics. It highlighted the difference between a leader who was comfortable in his own skin and one who was perpetually performing. The irony was thick enough to cut. While Trump was trying to look like a wartime president in a photo op, the actual historical record was being rewritten in real time. Major news outlets like the New York Times and CNN were drawing sharp contrasts between Trump's past and present. They unearthed tweets and statements from 2012 and 2013 where Trump had viciously attacked Obama, warning that he would launch a strike in Libya or Iran to boost his poll numbers. He might launch a strike in Libya or Iran out of desperation, Trump had said of Obama. Now he was the one ordering strikes, escalating tensions in the Middle East, and warning that the mission would continue in full force. The man who ran for office on a platform of ending endless wars and called himself the President of Peace was now overseeing military operations that risked engulfing the region. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it was also predictable. What wasn't predictable was the way Obama's simple statement about shame cut through the noise. It wasn't a policy debate. It wasn't about the specifics of the Iran strikes or the budget or the border. It was about character. It was about the baseline level of human decency required to lead a nation of 330 million people. In the weeks that followed, the story took on its own life. The video of Obama's interview clip was played on a loop. The word shame trended on social media. People wrote think pieces about the death of decorum. They wrote about the long history of racist imagery depicting black people as apes, and how the White House's defense of the Post as a Lion King meme was either willfully ignorant or maliciously cunning. Some tried to move on. Trump, ever the master of the news cycle, tried to change the subject. Just days after the furor over the Obama video, he pivoted to a new shiny object: aliens. He announced that he would release government files on UFOs and extraterrestrial phenomena. In typical fashion, he managed to tie it back to Obama, accusing the former president of leaking secret information about aliens during a podcast appearance. It was a dizzying whipsaw. From racist memes to alien invasions in the span of a week, it was the clown show Obama had talked about, operating at full capacity. But the alien story didn't stick. Neither did the attempts to move past the controversy. The reason it didn't stick was the silence that followed Obama's words. People couldn't unhear it. They couldn't unsee the juxtaposition. One man, out of office, speaking with the moral clarity of a leader, the other, in the Oval Office, posting memes and picking fights. The silence was also physical. It was the silence in the room when Obama spoke. It was the silence in the news studios after the clip ended. It was the silence of people processing the fact that the guardrails were gone and that someone had finally pointed it out. Barack Obama didn't plan to be the voice of resistance. He had spent his post-presidency being carefully apolitical, writing his memoirs, building his library, staying out of the daily mudslinging. But some moments demanded a response, not because the political calculus favored it, but because the human calculus did. When the image of you and your wife, the woman you love, the mother of your children, a woman who had served this country with nothing but grace and dignity, is used as a racist punchline by the sitting president, silence is not an option. Michelle had seen the video too. They had talked about it privately in the quiet of their home. She was stronger than anyone he knew, but even she felt the weight of it. It wasn't just an attack on them. It was an attack on the idea that black people could occupy the highest office in the land without being reduced to a stereotype. It was an attack on every little black girl and boy who had looked at them and seen possibility. So when Obama sat down in that chair in Chicago, he wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for them. He was drawing a line in the sand, not with a sword, but with a word: shame. The reaction was immediate. Ben Rhodes, his former national security advisor and close confidant, took to X with a message that captured the sentiment of a generation of Obama alumni and supporters. Let it haunt Trump and his racist followers that future Americans will embrace the Obamas as beloved figures while studying him as a stain in our history. It was a curse and a prophecy rolled into one. It was the belief that history has a long memory and that the judgment of the future is far more brutal than the judgment of the present. As the days turned into weeks, the political landscape continued to churn. The strikes on Iran continued, with Trump giving varying timelines for the conflict, sometimes saying it could be over in days, other times suggesting the U.S. might take over the whole thing. The comparisons to his past criticisms of Obama grew sharper. The Washington Post and Politico ran pieces highlighting the flip-flops. The BBC highlighted the contradiction between his promise to end wars and his actions that were expanding them. But beneath the surface of the daily news cycle, a quieter conversation was happening. It was happening in classrooms where teachers used Obama's words to discuss civics and decency. It was happening in churches where pastors preached about the power of shame as a moral compass. It was happening in families where parents tried to explain to their children why the President of the United States would post something so hurtful. In one such living room in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, a father sat with his teenage daughter. She had seen the video on her phone. She was confused. Why would he do that? Why would anyone think that's okay? The father, a man who had voted for both Democrats and Republicans in his life, struggled to find an answer. He thought about Obama's interview. He thought about the word shame. "I don't think he does think it's okay," the father said slowly. "I think that's the problem. He doesn't think anything is not okay, and that's what the other president was talking about. When you lose the ability to be ashamed of yourself, you lose the thing that makes you human." The daughter looked back at her phone, at the screen where the controversy lived. "So we just have to live with this?" The father shook his head. "No, we have to remember it. We have to remember that there was a time when a president acted this way, and that there was a time when another president stood up and said it wasn't right. And we have to decide which one we want to be." The story of that winter evening in Chicago became a landmark in the tumultuous landscape of the second Trump presidency. It was a moment when the past reached into the present and offered a verdict. Barack Obama, the 44th president, had not sought this confrontation. He had not needed to, but when it found him, he met it with the only weapon he had left, the truth. The brutal truth was that shame was gone. The brutal truth was that cruelty had been normalized. The brutal truth was that a sitting president had used racist imagery against his predecessor and faced few consequences from his party. But there was another truth, too. The truth that millions of Americans heard Obama's words and felt seen. The truth that the silence in that room in Chicago was not an empty silence, but a full one. A silence of respect, of attention, of a nation holding its breath to hear what wisdom sounded like. In the years to come, when historians write the story of this era, they will likely focus on the big events, the wars, the elections, the Supreme Court decisions. But the people who lived through it will remember something else. They will remember a video of a former president standing in an unfinished building in his hometown, looking into a camera and mourning the loss of something as simple and profound as shame. They will remember the silence that followed, and they will know in that silence they heard the voice of a leader, not because he held power, but because he held on to something rarer, his dignity.